All right. So later today, I'm going to be giving a talk based on some of my dissertation work, as this one is too. The talk later today deals with the FBI's first campaign against the animal rights movement and the invention of the notion of animal rights terrorism. And it largely deals with the 1980s, and it comes from my Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the FBI, and which the FBI continues to argue in federal court, that my dissertation research itself is a threat to national security. I'm going to at that talk, I will be showing some documents that which have never been published before about the FBI's first campaigns against the animal rights movement in the 1980s. This talk is also from my dissertation, but it is looking at the history, the deeper history of repression. Because repression against animal activists did not begin in the 1980s or even the 1970s. So, and with all due respect to my very close friend and colleague Will Putter, the name of this talk is Green is the Old Red. I've seen parts of it before, I apologize. The next one is brand new, I promise. All right. So the fact is that from the earliest days of our movement, the rhetoric and apparatus of national security have been used to marginalize animal protectionists as threats to the state. For example, in 1917, on the eve of American entry into World War I, the American anti-vivisection movement at that time was a powerhouse. And when the Red Cross decided to spend $100,000 to fund war-related animal experiments, primarily wound experiments on cats, the various anti-vivisection groups in the United States unified to shut down the Red Cross labs. Determined to prevent such an outcome, one of America's most brilliant medical men leapt into action. In addition to being the country's most famous surgeon, William Keene was also America's foremost pro-vivisection activist. And as you can see here, he was also a military man. He actually served in uniform in a medical capacity in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and here in World War I. He also performed surgery on U.S. presidents. I mean, it's difficult to overstate how important of a figure William Keene was. And this military man devised a war-related strategy to defeat the anti-vivisection assaults against Red Cross vivisection. In the prestigious magazine Science, Keene authored a widely cited and reprinted article that would sound familiar to many of us here today if it was coming out of the anti-animal rights movement groups today, titled "The Red Cross and the Anti-Vivisectionists, an Appeal to the Families and Friends of Our Heroic Troops and to the Common Sense of the American People." Keene informed his readers that, quote, "Anyone endeavoring to stop the Red Cross from assisting in its humanitarian and humane desire to prevent American soldiers from being diseased is in reality giving aid and comfort to the enemy." Other vivisectors soon followed suit, labeling the anti-vivisectionists, quote, "most unpatriotic and even seditious." The New York Times and other newspapers avidly agreed. Representatively, one paper speculated that, quote, "if the anti-vivisectionists are not actually in the employment of the German government, they are at least consciously or unconsciously furthering German interests. Further, their activities are under suspicion and constitute a warrant to resort to repressive measures." In the blood-drenched and incarceration-happy world of the American home front during World War I, these are hardly idle words. It was a bloodbath on the American home front as well. People were being lynched for being German in the United States. In one town in Ohio, all of the dogs of German breeds, so German Shepherds, Dachshunds, were rounded up and shot and set on fire in the center of the square. So when we're talking about allegations of subversion for opposing anti-vivisection, these are not idle words. This is not mere rhetoric.
Where was this? Here in the United States?
Here in the United States, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the World War I home front was a tremendously repressive place. It's where the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed, which I'll talk about momentarily. If anyone is interested in reading more about the World War I home front, broadly along these repressive lines, Chris Capizola's books, the merit of San Juan Shoe, is a fantastic book about that topic. So seriously did Keene again, Keene. So seriously did Keene view the threat posed by anti-vivisectionists to the security of the United States that he actually called for charges to be brought against the anti-vivisectionists under the new Wartime Espionage Act. Keep in mind that this is the same odious law, the Espionage Act, under which Chelsea Manning was convicted, Edward Snowden is facing charges, and Daniel Ellsberg was prosecuted for releasing the Pentagon Papers, which exposed decades of American lies about the Vietnam War. And though no Espionage Act trials materialized during World War I, despite Keene's close personal friendship with President Wilson, he nonetheless succeeded in marginalizing anti-vivisectionists as threats to American security. And this stigma would endure long past the end of World War I, as the prestigious magazine Nature proclaimed at war's end, quote, "The war in Europe has burned deep into the hearts of all of us this lesson, that the magnificent work of our Army Medical Services is indeed founded and built upon knowledge made possible by animal experimentation." Continued Nature, and citing Keene, quote, "Not all of the anti-vivisection societies in the world will ever persuade us to forget that lesson of the war." Skipping ahead now, the anti-vivisection movement began to recover by the end of World War II and was the strongest it had been in decades. And this resurgent post-World War II anti-vivisection movement caused the American biomedical community to respond with the formation of a new pro-vivisection group called the National Society for Medical Research. And this was really the most powerful pro-vivisection group that the United States has ever seen. The NSMR, the National Society for Medical Research, for decades was the giant of the pro-vivisection movement. And as opposed to today, where many of the pro-vivisection groups are headed by, they're essentially mercenary groups. They don't necessarily believe anything. They're just PR groups paid by whoever is going to write the biggest checks. This was not the time. This was not the case with the National Society for Medical Research. It was founded and run by, like Keene, some of the most prestigious medical men in the country. And NSMR, the National Society for Medical Research, was co-founded and headed by Vice President of the University of Illinois, Andrew Conway Ivey. And like his predecessor, Keene, Ivey was a titan of American medical research, something of a rock star vivisector. He was one of the most respected medical researchers in the country. He was also a seasoned veteran of fights with anti-vivisectionists dating back to the 1930s. Additionally, Ivey had been selected by the American Medical Association to serve as the expert witness on medical ethics for the prosecution at the trial of Nazi doctors in Nuremberg, a role for which Time magazine dubbed Ivey, quote, "the conscience of US science." On many points, Ivey and his NSMR followed Keene's playbook to a T. One of NSMR's top priorities was to secure passage of laws mandating the surrender of dogs and cats to research institutions, a practice known as pound seizure. In support of these efforts, Ivey developed a devastatingly effective line of argument, again, casting anti-vivisectionists as dire threats to American security. Immediately upon his return from Nuremberg in 1947, and he is a true celebrity at this point, news crews follow him wherever he is going. Again, the conscience of US science is Time magazine. Ivey, who is also referred to by Time as a one-man medical information bureau for newsmen, informed the American press that while in Germany, he'd learned an interesting thing. It turns out, Ivey claimed, that the Nazis banned experiments on animals in 1933, and that this alleged Nazi ban on animal experimentation actually led to the human experimentation in the concentration camps. This assertion was flatly untrue. I'm going to say it again, this is false, completely untrue. Ivey even knew this explicitly while on the stand in Nuremberg. Ivey actually explicitly discussed the routine conduct of animal experimentation not just within Nazi Germany, but even in the concentration camps itself. I have 2 chapters on this in the dissertation if you actually want more on that. But for now, the point is, Ivey, actually just flat out lying, came back, and when the press was gathered to hear about what sort of insights he gained from this horrific trial, the trial of concentration camp doctors, Ivey came back and said, the reason that all of this happened is because Hitler banned experimentation on animals in 1933. The Nazis didn't have animals to use after that point, and so they had to use human beings. Totally untrue, but the press absolutely ate it up. And the National Society for Medical Research, Ivey's group, quickly made Ivey's assertions regarding the supposed Nazi ban on vivisection a central feature of the NSMR's campaigns. a 1948, this is Ivy at the trial, testifying. The 1948 NSMR pamphlet contained a pledge for the support of animal experimentation. It read that the underside condemned, quote, all efforts to stop medical research or to bring the Nazi anti-vivisection system to America by substituting human experiments for animal experiments. And a subsequent memo from NSMR to its member groups declared that, quote, it may be a matter of orthodoxy for fascists to be anti-vivisectionists. In 1933, under Hitler, the first and only national anti-vivisection law was adopted. And then the memo continued, quote, Buchenwald and Dachau could be regarded as grisly monuments to the anti-vivisection creed. Alerting his listeners to this terrible menace, a Chicago vivisector and local radio personality broadcast in 1949 that, quote, even Allied victory and the Nuremberg trials were apparently not enough to stop the anti-vivisectionists. NSMR's focus soon shifted from World War II to World War III. With rapidly degenerating relations between the US and the Soviet Union, anti-communism took a central position in the emerging language of early Cold War Americanism. And in this climate, NSMR deftly argued that by opposing the surrender of pound animals to research institutions, some of which were conducting radiation experiments, anti-vivisectionists were, quote, undermining just the work an enemy would undermine to leave us unprepared to meet a wartime crisis. When fused with NSMR's accusations regarding the supposed Nazi ban on vivisection, this line of attack, which directly linked anti-vivisectionists to foreign enemies from both the last war and the next, proved devastating, and the testing ground for this new strategy was Proposition C, the Los Angeles Pro-Pound Seizure Initiative of 1950. And to that end, over morning coffee, Los Angelinos read of the supposed Nazi ban on vivisection and were warned that, quote, if medical research is to continue in the United States, research on dogs and cats must also continue unless we, like Hitler, use human beings instead. Then, NSMR's local branch released a report declaring that, quote, the fanatics who oppose animal experimentation for sentimental reasons are being joined and in some parts led by communists and communist sympathizers interested in sabotaging national defense. This report, carried widely in the press, informed LA that, quote, national defense projects aimed at minimizing deaths from possible attacks with atomic bombs were being crippled by anti-vivisectionists, and that, quote, foreign agents rejoice at every victory scored by anti-vivisectionists. The Los Angeles Times itself concurred, declaring, quote, it is beyond dispute that animal experimentation is necessary for the national defense, and opposition to it plays directly into the hands of the Russian communists and their schemes to overthrow the United States. This is a press from Proposition C. And in large part due to such appeals, and despite Los Angeles at that time as now being an anti-vivisection stronghold, Proposition C passed with a healthy margin, mandating as in requiring the surrender of dogs and cats at pounds to research institutions. In the wake of this success for NSMR, the NSMR enshrined the myth of the Nazi ban on vivisection as part of the official definition of animal experimentation in Encyclopedia Britannica itself. Scientific, military, and civilian leaders publicly linked animal experiments and pound seizure policies with protection from nuclear holocaust. 1951 New York headlines announced the coming of the Atomic Era Vivisection Bill, which was an NSMR pro-pound seizure mandate very similar to and modeled on Proposition C. People magazine featured research pound pup, quote, the dog Blackie, a pound dog, who read the caption, quote, may save thousands from A-bombs. And as this next slide depicts, as Lassie stares stoically past the mushroom cloud in this 1952 Pittman Moore pharmaceutical ad designed by NSMR, America was instructed that, quote, we must think animals if good comes from the atomic bomb. Skipping ahead one last time, and to the 1980s, and this is something I'm going to talk more about in my talk later today. In response to the meteoric rise of the modern animal rights movement, which is really a 1970s phenomena and then into the 1980s, the American biomedical community again targeted animal protectionists as threats to American security. This time, however, instead of Kaiserism, Hitlerism, or communism, our opponents invoked terrorism. Indeed, even Louis Sullivan, the head of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, flatly declared that our movement is a bunch of, quote, animal rights terrorists. Some in our movement began to cower. I mean, it's scary to be called a terrorist, I'll admit, having been called one, but someone who did not cower, along with many others, but in particular, was the great animal rights activist pioneer, Henry Shapiro. And if you don't know about Henry Shapiro, you absolutely should. It's too bad I don't have more time. We don't have more time to discuss Henry Shapiro now, because he is truly one of the greatest figures that our movement has produced and done so much for animals. But Henry Shapiro fought back, even taking out full-page ads in major newspaper, making clear who the real terrorists are. Most importantly, Shapiro not only fought back, but he actually intensified his activism for animals. So, among the many lessons the great animal rights movement pioneer Henry Shapiro has left us is this: when government, law enforcement, and the animal abuse industries collude in attempts to marginalize us with accusations of terrorism or whatever the buzzword of the day happens to be, through allegations that this great movement for compassion is somehow a threat to national security, we do not give them what they want. We do not run, we do not cower, we do not stay silent, and most importantly, we never stop fighting for animals. As is clear from the history we've covered today and that Tino covered, though the purpose of these tactics, what we'll term these green scare tactics, and their historical precedents, though the purpose of these green scare tactics is to instill fear in us, what they truly reveal is how powerful of an impact we're actually having. Animal abuse industries and their protectors are desperate, and just as it's been since the earliest days of our movement, that's why they resort to these preposterous measures. So, when we leave this conference and return to our daily lives and our own activism for animals, whatever form that may take, let's all remember this: those who torture animals for fun and profit want us scared. They want us to be afraid. Fuck fear, they're terrified of us. Let's go remind them why.